Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm very happy and very honored to be joined today by a new guest, Dr. Joanna Lei, who is joining us from Taiwan today. Dr. Lei was educated in Taiwan and in the United States. She did her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. She was in the Legislative Yuan, the Taiwanese parliament, for, I believe, 3 years, elected from Taipei. And she's been on neutrality studies a couple of times with my colleague and friend Pascal Lota. She appeared once with Jeffrey Sachs, the renowned economist, and a second time she appeared to talk about some recent events in Taiwan. And what really got my attention was when the conversation pivoted to Washington trying to make Taiwan into the next Ukraine. I was very alarmed by this. And so I wanted to have her on to talk about some recent developments in Taiwan. Dr. Lei, welcome and thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm very glad to have more international media attention to what's actually happening in Taiwan at this point. You're right, it is a very critical time.
So let's jump right in then and talk about what's going on in Taiwan. The president of Taiwan, Lai Ching-te, he gave a speech a couple of days ago. Today is May 22nd. He gave a major speech on May the 20th, which I believe marked 1 year in office since his January 2024 election, and then he inaugurated in May. Before that, this is something that you mentioned on Pascal's show in April the 26th, I believe. There was a major rally in Taiwan against what sounds like some very serious political machinations or some skullduggery, some very strange things going on in Taiwan. Can you give us a little context? What's going on and what is President Lai up to, and why is nobody in the Western media talking about Taiwan right now?
Well, certainly people understand that the DPP government has been held as the model democracy value partner by both the Democratic President Biden and the now Republican President Trump. So in that overall gesture, people swept a lot of things under the rug. For example, during the 1 year anniversary or prior to the 1 year anniversary, if you were on the ground in Taiwan, you would see a rapid deterioration of the Taiwan democracy. There were three very important telltale signs. One is at the tail end of the Tsai Ing-wen government, they passed a lot of laws that would be constituted as bill of attainder. Is targeted to the opposition party. When Lai Ching-te assumed his office in May 20th last year, the law was implemented to the nth degree, and then more recently, the DPP government has waged something they call the general recall, 大罢免. Typically, you would recall one or two legislators, which are senators in our system, if they really didn't do a good job. So there were a couple of senators being recalled by their constituents. But this is a very entirely different beast because the ruling party, DPP, decided to do a great general recall of over 30, 40 KMT and another party's legislators. In other words, instead of dismissing the Congress and have a general re-election, if you truly believe that the current legislators are not representing the real sense of the people, then you can dismiss the Congress, have a general re-election. But instead, they use what they call 大罢免, the general recall, to target over 35 different legislators of the opposition party. But the third movement on top of that general recall, which is a political move. The third thing was they decided to use judicial power to target people who led the counter recall, meaning KMT recalling the ruling party DPP legislators. So the counter recalls leaders were being investigated by the judicial branch, and to date, there were nearly 10 of them being incarcerated incommunicado, meaning they were jailed without communication with the outside world. So you could see that there were a lot of things that does not fit the bill of a model democracy. And I forgot to mention another really big one. That is, they have jailed the chairman of the opposition party, the People's Party, for over 6 months by now. So in that sense, you can see there is a deterioration of the overall democratic system. It's hurting the balance of power or separation of power because the administrative branch is using its power to influence the judicial branch. Then it's also impacting the balance within the legislative branch, which has a minority DPP and a majority opposition composition at this time. So what we're seeing on the ground is Taiwan's so-called democracy is deteriorating to the nth degree, and therefore April 26th, people walked on the streets, and that is a place that we typically hold our political rallies. And there were more than 250,000 people attending that very large opposition party waged mass rally, but you don't hear any major Western media reporting that at all, because they still allow the DPP to claim that they are the model democracy, they are the value partner, they are the human rights protector. And to date, the May 20th speech, as you mentioned earlier, Lai Ching-te still walked that path and said that the 1 year anniversary marked a lot of fantastic achievements by the DPP. But I think it's important to know that when we talk about truth, it has to be the truth, nothing but the truth, and the whole truth. He didn't tell the whole truth. In his words, this is still a model democracy that's working, but he didn't mention any of the people who are incarcerated, incommunicado, and all the massive rallies against what he's trying to do in using political force to change the balance in our Congress. So it is not the truth, the whole truth, and nothing about the truth is not being protected at all.
I would encourage people listening to this to read. It's available in English online, to read the speech that President Lai gave on May the 20th. It's festooned with celebrations of democracy. Taiwan is a model democracy. And at the end, he concludes, right before the end, he concludes with almost a profession of fealty to the United States, and Taiwan will be working in partnership with the United States. And it sounds to me, knowing from you, thanks to you, knowing what's been going on inside of Taiwan, it sounds to me like very, very intense propaganda. Here's someone who has been propped up in the Western media as a champion of democracy. Mm-hmm. He used the word democracy. I lost count of how many times in his speech he said the word democracy. And yet, as you just mentioned, there's someone who's been imprisoned in a political prisoner, I think we could call him, for 6 months incommunicado without a trial. And I believe you're referring to Ko Wan-je, who was the...
Yeah. Let me just make it clear to everyone. Ko Wan-je was first arrested for alleged misuse of campaign funds, but then he was held for at least 4 months without trial before he was finally charged and sent to the real court. But our system allows you to continue hold people incarcerated even after he is being tried in court. So to date, he has not been released. He was not even able to see his father in his deathbed. Actually, they did give him a couple of hours to see his father in his deathbed, and his father has now passed away. So that's Ko Wan-je, the chairperson who ran against Lai Ching-te in the last presidential election. In fact, he had garnered over 20% of the vote. So if you look at what Lai Ching-te has done in the first year of his time in office, he managed to ring in all the opposition members within his parties. The ones who did not work in his friction are being charged. At least 3 of them have been charged. So they no longer would have a political career. At least they would not challenge him in the next presidential election. Then he enlarged his circle of opposition by getting Ko Wan-je, who is the chairperson who ran against him in the presidential election, to be a criminal of misusing campaign funds and also embezzlements and other sorts, because Ko Wen-je was the mayor of Taipei. So they actually managed to charge him for 3 things. Now he's being tried, but he's not released. He's still incarcerated. Then for the young people who led the recall of the DPP senators, they were sometimes KMT local party cadres. These people are being incarcerated incommunicado without being charged. And they will be held for 2 months at a time. And that would give them plenty of time to push the DPP general recall without having their senators being recalled by the opposition. So there are a very, very large movement by using the judicial branch against political oppositions. And that is what Lai Ching-te didn't say in his May 20th address.
None of this sounds like democracy to me, at
Not
least
at
not
all.
as we understand it. It sounds like, just to give people a little bit of background, if I may, some people might not be familiar with Taiwanese history or politics. When you say KMT, you mean the Kuomintang, the old party of Chiang Kai-shek, that is traditionally in
The
favor
ruling
of
party until 2000, and then also the ruling party between 2008 to 2016.
under Ma Ying-jeou, is that right?
Correct.
The president from in the 2000s. And this is the party that's traditionally favored a more stable relationship with the mainland and has not been pushing Taiwanese independence. It's traditionally been a status quo party. And the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, the current party in power under President Lai, and then before him, his predecessor, President Tsai Ing-wen, the female president, they have been, it seems to me, very much influenced by the United States. And you mentioned something in your interview with Pascal that I found very alarming, that there are now American advisors are now perhaps being welcomed into the Taiwanese government, into the presidential, or I should say the central government in Taiwan. This is quite frightening to me. So you've got the Kuomintang, which is favoring stable relations with the the People's Republic of China right next door, and then you've got a very, very aggressive, progressive party that is, it seems to me, attempting to move Taiwan into the orbit of not so much the United States, but Washington, whatever Washington wants in East Asia. Can you explain a little bit about why this is happening and what's going on inside of Taiwan? This recall sounds more like a purge to me, and
It
the
is a
counter
purge.
recall sounds more like an attempt to stop the purge, and the people who have been purged are now being put into prison to stop them from resisting what is this purge. Can you explain what brought all this about?
Okay, let me just quickly address the purging part. The recall is a very unique system. You need to have 1% of the people in the constituents signing a petition for the first phase. And then you need 10% of the people signing a petition in order to do a general election for the constituents. So the ones who are leading the petition are now being put in jail. So whatever they're trying to do probably will not be put through a general election or general vote by the real people of the constituents. And that is a way to stop KMT from waging a counter recall. So let me go back to the 3 moving parts. You have mentioned 3 moving parts. You have DPP, who used to be an opposition party, and in fact, it was not a party until the 1990s. And then you have KMT and mainland China's Communist Party. These 2 parties have a very long history of understanding, fighting each other. So KMT was not always a pro sort of stability and peace party. In fact, in 1949, when KMT lost its war, the civil war in mainland China, it moved to Taiwan, and the initial phase still has a very strong position of trying to fight the civil war against the Communist Party. And at the time, the United States have decided to abandon the Chiang Kai-shek government at one point and decided to recognize it at the time of the Korean War, because Taiwan will be a very important base for the Korean War, and Taiwan was an even more important base during the Vietnam War. So it is very clear that during the Korean War and the Vietnam War, Taiwan was used as a U.S. military and other bases against the then Soviet Union and the PRC. So what we can see is the United States have moved its position. It started not recognizing the Chiang Kai-shek government and then recognizing the Chiang Kai-shek government to wage the counteroffenses against USSR and PRC. And then in 1970s, and it is very important for people to remember the time, because it is at the time of the two oil crisis. In the 1970s, the United States all of a sudden also changed its overall grand strategy vis-a-vis Soviet Union and PRC, and that is what we call the Kissinger Doctrine. They started not recognizing Taiwan in the United Nations because ROC, the government in Taiwan, was the founding member of the United Nations and was holding the seat in the Security Council. But all of a sudden in 1972, Taiwan was ousted from the United Nations. And then in 1979, they decided to sever the diplomatic relationship with the government in Taiwan, the ROC government, and use another tactic to normalize, quote unquote, their relationship with PRC in Beijing, so that they can use Beijing as a way to combat or to balance the power of USSR. So the long story short is Taiwan, in terms of the parties and the relationship with PRC, has always been a part of the US game. And KMT, as a very long-term ruling party starting from 1911, so now it's over 100 years old, had a very long history of understanding mainland China, understanding People's Republic of China, understanding the Communist Party in China. So it doesn't have a lot of illusion, but it has a very long history in managing peace. And that is something I'd like to say. I am 66 years old. I was born in 1958. 1958 was the last time regimes, governments, armies across the Taiwan Straits have a hard, direct confrontation in Jinmen. Jinmen actually received over 400,000 bombshells in 1958. And that is really important to remember, because since then, we have, even though we're still officially in a civil war, the two governments have not ceased to claim that they have the only representation of the entire China, but the two governments did not engage in any hot war, the kinds of combat you see in Ukraine or in Israel. There was no hard combat since 1958. So while we were officially or technically at war, we actually managed peace. And the time that KMT ruled was the longest time of managing that peace. In addition to that, 2005, Lian Zhan, the then KMT chairperson, led a delegation. I was part of the delegation to Beijing, officially engaged the Communist Party and said, let's start a conversation to discuss our peaceful co-development going forward. So 2005 opened an era of negotiation, of moving towards an eventual peace. And Ma Ying-jeou's 8 years saw the results of that. There were over 22 ministry-to-ministry meetings and over 30 agreements across the governments across Taiwan Straits. So we were able to manage peace, and most of that, actually all of that, was done under the KMT regime. And what I'm trying to say is KMT didn't have an illusion that we don't have a confrontation. It didn't have an illusion that we didn't have a war, because it managed that war. But KMT also saw a possibility of peace, starting from 2005, Lian Zhan, and 2008 to 16, Ma Ying-jeou. We saw the ability to open door and have ministry-to-ministry negotiation across Taiwan Straits without any foreign intervention. So now, when Lai Ching-te and Tsai Ing-wen came into the office, because of their extreme Taiwan independence position, they needed the support of Japan and the United States. So they keep saying that we really, really need Japan to support Taiwan. We really, really need U.S. to support Taiwan. And at the time, Abe, the prime minister in Japan, as well as Biden in the United States, have said that they will support Taiwan, and their support is solid as rock. So that's interpreted as a support, a backstop of a Taiwan independence movement. And now we're seeing it deteriorating to an nth degree.
What you're saying here is something that is almost never mentioned in the American media or in Japan, for that matter. People here in Japan talk very much about Taiwan. It's a very solid conservative position to express support for Taiwan. But I often wonder whether people who claim to support Taiwan know what that means concretely. What it will eventuate in, I think, is a hot war with the People's Republic of China, which would lead perhaps to the annihilation of Taiwan. It would certainly cause tremendous damage and suffering in Taiwan and in Japan. Mm-hmm. And it would seem to me that if such a war were to break out, then Taiwan really would become the next Ukraine, in the sense that the Americans would not send troops. We would watch on television as people in a foreign country died, while politicians in Washington and perhaps also in Tokyo claimed to support, for the sake of freedom and democracy, these people who were dying in the streets of a distant foreign country. It seems that Taiwan remains a pawn in Washington politics, and now it's become a pawn in American politics. The people inside of Taiwan must have a very different view of all this. I'm sure they don't want to be a pawn of anyone. I'm sure they have their own ideas. And one thing I also wanted to discuss, and just reading your background a bit, I've long been interested in the pro-life movement inside of Taiwan and in some of these moral issues that are going on inside of Taiwan. The LGBT movement, I've seen President Lai and then formerly President Tsai have been at these LGBT parades. And I know that there are many people in Taiwan who don't agree with this and who have been trying to stop this. Perhaps you could call it a second kind of civil war, a culture war inside of Taiwan. This never gets mentioned in the American media. People think that Taiwan is this democratic paradise, but there are a lot of things going on inside of Taiwan that conservatives in the United States or in Japan would agree with the KMT much more than they would agree with the DPP, the Progressive Party, on social issues. Can you bring up a little bit of what's going on inside of Japan socially, inside of Taiwan socially, and what a war with China would really mean for Taiwan?
I'm glad you mentioned this, but I think it's really, really clear that when the United States is moving in the woke culture and the DEI movement, Taiwan followed suit. So Tsai Ing-wen and Lai Ching-te both followed really, really closely the DEI movement. In fact, a lot of the spokesperson or a lot of the rallies were held in Taipei. So Taipei is not only touted as a model democracy, but also, held as a value partner, and the value, quote unquote, is the DEI culture, the woke culture. So once we understand the sort of underpinning, then it's really, really clear that why both Tsai Ing-wen and Lai Ching-te got so much support, especially from the Democratic Party, so much so that even Pelosi came to Taiwan with no tangible agenda. I just want to share with people a little bit. When Pelosi came to Taiwan, everybody understood that was the sort of big, major military escalation across Taiwan Straits, because China reacted really badly. The visit of Pelosi, when she landed at about 10-ish at night, and until she left Taiwan, she actually didn't meet anyone very significant. In fact, she had so much time to kill. She went to a couple of parks which celebrated or commemorated the human rights of Taiwan without meeting any human rights leaders, not even the LGBT leaders in Taiwan. So you can see that there is a very big playbook, and it's a show being put on stage for its significance or whatever for her position. But there were nothing tangible, actually none, because I was trying to figure out whom she met, whether she would give them real strong support. So we have some people following her path, and she had so much time that she went to a very insignificant park around the sort of Taipei County, and she didn't meet anyone there. So let me go back to how people really feel. I think initially when war was still so far away, people didn't really take it very seriously. But when now we see what happened to Ukraine, especially how Trump tried to just get out of Ukraine, having Ukraine to agree to all American conditions, terms and conditions, without promising what Ukraine wanted, without even recognizing that the Ukraine situation was initially promoted by the Democratic leaders, starting from Clinton. They kept talking about Georgia and Ukraine having a path going into NATO, and that's way back when. It's when Soviet Union simply just ended, and it was at a time when Warsaw Pact was supposed to also bring in the end of the NATO. So you could see what happened to Ukraine and Georgia, and then people can see what will happen to Taiwan. It is now more clear than ever, especially after they tried to get out of Ukraine. Recently, Rubio said to everyone, I think it's just a day or two ago, he mentioned that U.S. has to get out of Europe and has to get out of Middle East to manage a new Middle East balance so that it can focus its attention to the West Pacific. So now it's very, very clear that there is a progression. Ukraine first, Israel second, and now it's time for them to focus in the West Pacific. And here we have three major U.S. theses. One is Taiwan is a major democracy against a totalitarian PRC. Second is Taiwan is a value partner, but also it is also holding Taiwan Strait, which is the lifeline from the Middle East to Japan. And now a tangent of that second thesis is Taiwan is where TSMC is or NVIDIA will be. So chips and AI will be very important to the entire world. So whatever happens to Taiwan, the world must pay attention. And by that saying, the world must come to defend, right? And then the last one, the third thesis is US and the rest of the countries should have and will have freedom of passage in the South Pacific, as well as the South China Sea. So if we look at the three major scenarios that US painted, they would put Taiwan right in the forefront of any potential confrontation in the first island chain and also the entire Indo-Pacific. So I think people in Taiwan are gradually realizing that if there were any select field of confrontation. If someone wants to pick a theater for a confrontation, Taiwan, the Philippines are probably the number 1, 2. Before, people were talking about India and China because they had a very long border conflicts. But after India and Pakistan, probably it wouldn't happen because the demonstration of force is so clear. So now it goes back to Taiwan, Philippines, and perhaps somewhere around Okinawa. We are at the forefront of a potential conflict. And if the conflict happens, PRC has demonstrated its ability and its modern build-out of People's Liberation Army, especially in April this year. So there were 3 or 4 military exercises. I don't think they're exercises. Even the US generals calling them rehearsals. So you're now seeing how, if and when there will be a war, the war will be managed in such a way that they demonstrate to you what the battlefield situation is and how they would go about it 1, 2, and 3. So more people are now thinking about a real tangible confrontation happening on Taiwan, which is an extremely small island. Therefore, we have actually a problem of getting enough Army, Navy, Air Force recruits. The cadets are not reporting. This year, we have about 30% of the cadets wanting to join the Army, Navy, or Air Force in September. We also have a large problem of people not wanting to serve in their military service, which is compulsory. Usually, in the last couple of years, we have reduced the compulsory military service to 4 months, basically to allow every man no women, every man to at least know how to operate basic weaponry. But with the U.S. support and U.S. pushing, we are now adding the 4 months back to 1 year. So all young men will now be subject to a 1 year military service, and a lot of them are trying to avoid going back into the 1 year military service. That is because war is now more tangible. It is closer, more pacing. It's more likely that would happen. So when you say how people feel about it, I think it used to be a very distant scenario. Like I said, I'm 66 years old. We didn't have war between Taiwan Straits for 66 years. So that's a very distant scenario. But now it seems to be coming our way. And then we changed our law locally so that if you are a US citizen, you can serve in the government, which is not allowed. You can't even go into the Congress as a foreign national. So we changed the law so that foreign nationals, for example, if you're a US citizen, you can go into our government and hold positions, be advisors or more stable of office. And then we have a lot more military advisors coming onto Taiwan. That's the first time ever since 1979. Because during the severance of the diplomatic relation and the normalization with PRC, U.S. promised 3 things: sever the relationship with Taiwan diplomatic officially, remove all the military personnel from Taiwan. They used to have a very large base in Taipei and another very large naval base in Zuoying. So remove the military personnel from Taiwan. And then the third one is to stop operating the Joint Defense Treaty. We actually had a very strong Joint Defense Treaty, just like US and Japan has. So all 3 was supposed to stop in operation in 1979, and now we're seeing them coming back.
This is quite alarming, and I don't know that anyone in major American media outlets is reporting this, at least not to the level that it should be. So what you're talking about is not just a pre-2022 Ukraine situation, but almost a Vietnam situation where now you have the advisors coming in. That's how it begins. And then there will be some incident, perhaps it will be planned or unplanned, and there will be Americans who will be killed or involved in some way. And then you will begin to have troops coming in and full-scale military operations. As you said, even the so-called exercises are being treated as rehearsals. These are attempts to war game their way into an actual war, it would seem, in Taiwan. And I think it's very significant that the people in Taiwan have changed their view of the geopolitical map now. That it used to be that the reporting at least in Japan, was that people in Taiwan are ready. We know that we're all fighting for freedom and democracy, and the people are very tough and they're ready to die on the cliffs fighting the communists and so forth. But to hear you report it, and to hear the 250,000+ people who are in the streets of Taipei, they are not satisfied with the level of democracy in Taiwan, and they're not prepared to die for an American game. What sounds to me that's happening, it's not just Ukraine or Vietnam happening again. It's an extension of the old Western mercantilism, imperialism. I remember in the run-up to the 2024 election, one of the candidates, Vivek Ramaswamy, gave a speech in a very Nixonian vein saying that we had to protect Taiwan until we could make the chips in America, and then we could cut Taiwan loose. I was quite shocked by that. I don't know if it was covered in Taiwan, but this is basically saying we don't care about the people of Taiwan. We just want what they can give us, and when we can get it for ourselves, then we don't care about them. That seems to be the real position of Washington, and it seems that people in Taiwan have now understood that. So what happens going forward? I mean, it seems like the Taiwanese are, at least the Lai administration is preparing to buy even more military equipment from the Americans, let advisors in from Washington, play the empire game, no matter how many Taiwanese people are killed. What happens next in Taiwan now that democracy seems not to be functioning? It seems like a very dangerous time domestically as well.
It is indeed very dangerous. Let me give you 3 more data points. Usually in June 18th, there is a very large congregation to celebrate the cultural connection between Taiwan and Fujian. And this year, the government has earmarked that and saying that all the locals, including the local temples or local leaders going into there, could be subject to espionage influences.
Just for traveling to Fujian.
To Fujian. And because the theory is once you go to Fujian, you may be subject to any kind of influence, and you may bring those influence back to Taiwan and make our defense or our resolve to defend ourselves weaker. The second data point is the Minister of Education. We have a lot of cross-strait educational exchanges. Actually, at one point in Ma Ying-jeou's time, we opened our colleges, universities, because we have access capacity to mainland China students. So there were a lot of mainland Chinese students who would actually come to Taiwan for 1 year, 2 year, or 4 year education. Now, our Minister of Education recently claimed that they not only will not endorse, they actually will not encourage any cross-strait educational exchanges, not for elementary school children, junior high school children, or high school children, because in their views, once you engage in this kind of education exchanges, you will be, once again, affected, influenced by mainland China. That's the second point. And the third point is we have quite a few sort of local rituals, very local cultural rituals. Now, even the local rituals are being attacked or sometimes being warned by the current DPP government as having celebrated the Chinese gods or Chinese goddesses. So you can see that overall, the attempt to sever Taiwan's relationship with mainland China is not only in the political arena, but also in cultural and social arena overall. And that is to build an entirely different and unique Taiwan identity. This Taiwan identity will follow the Taiwan independence theory that since we are not Chinese and we don't have a long relationship with Chinese, then the Taiwanness, quote unquote, should have the right to do self-determination. And we should have the right to vote for our own future. And once we self-determine to be a different nation, then we should have, quote unquote, right to join the United Nations. So these are all a whole series of theories. But if you were anyone who worked in the United Nations, would know that this will not happen because U.S. has not supported Taiwan since 1972. Even with all the words and all the so-called Taiwan Support Act in the U.S. Congress, United States to this date have not said they will come back and recognize Taiwan. Right. They have not done something that's entirely within the U.S. wherewithal. If they wanted to do it, they can do it. And they have not done it. And they have not done it in the UN. And at the same time, PRC has strong relationship with over 183 countries, and in each and every one of their relationship, there has always been a very clear clause that PRC is the only representation of China, and that was the 1972 2758 resolution. So if you follow the Lai Ching-de's thesis, he may have a chance of building an entire different people, the Taiwan people, which has a lot to do with the South Island language groups, with the South Islanders, and then use that for a right to self-determination to participate in the UN. But if you look at political realities, there's no such possibility. So let's go back to how many people supported Lai Ching-de. 70% of the people voted in the last election. 40% voted for his party. So that's 28% in total. In the most recent public opinion polls, 1 year after his inauguration, the ones who didn't vote for him has an extremely low approval rate, less than 20%, starting from less than 10 to less than 20, because there are quite a few different polls. Less than 10 to 20% of the people who didn't vote for him approve for what he's doing in terms of being a leader and what he's doing in cross-strait relationship. And that's his biggest disapproval. And then the ones approving or voted for him has about half of the people still support him. So you can see Lai Ching-de is actually of an extreme minority position, and that is why I believe he's doing extreme political measures to secure and cement his position.
You touched on the identity question and also the political support. And this is something that I've been thinking about for a while in terms of Taiwan. When people are asked about their identity in Taiwan, I think there's a lot of confusion in Japan, in the United States. People in Taiwan overwhelmingly identify as Taiwanese, and I think that's political. I think they don't identify as a member of a Chinese mainland political party. But this identity question that you mentioned, I'm very glad you brought it up. This is almost never discussed in the United States. It seems to me as well that the DPP, especially under Tsai Ing-wen and now under President Lai, have been trying to create a new identity, a mixture of political identity and perhaps ethnic or linguistic identity, which completely excises the long-standing relationship with at least Fujian, Fujian province across the strait, if not China more broadly. But this is also a part, I think, of Taiwan's very, very, even before it was Taiwan, the island of Formosa, I think, going back very, very far in history, there is a deep cultural connection with Fujian. That's just a fact. But it seems what you're saying has confirmed something I've been suspecting for a while, which is that this very aggressive, progressive, pro-American movement in Japan and Taiwan is trying to erase this long connection with Fujian province, with the mainland, even to the point of it's almost as though people have been infected with a disease. If they go to Fujian, they come back and they're all considered to be spies or something. They're infected with some sort of ideology. It's very much the same as what's happening in the United States with China, that everyone who comes from China is suspected of being an agent of the Communist Party and so forth. Is that what's going on? Is there a sort of reverse ethnic cleansing almost, or a kind of identity war going on inside of Taiwan?
Let me give you, again, another data point. A lot of people who organized trips to mainland China, a lot of them are very local leaders. We have a system that we have Li, which is roughly about 2,000 to 3,000 households in one Li. So the leaders of a Li have oftentimes engaged in a lot of cross-strait cultural exchanges. They go to do sightseeing, go to look at the sort of traditional historical sites. Many of them are being investigated by our judicial system. When they come back, they're being asked, whom did you meet? Did you do something that's not in your agenda? Did they ask you to bring any messages back to Taiwan? And some of them were even being held for a day or two, and that's enough to scare people off. So you can see that there is a very strong movement to try to cut off the people-to-people exchanges, which is very, very hard to come back. My family came from mainland China in 1949. My father never saw his parents. He could never go back to his original homeland until his parents all passed away, until 1980s. So there were a long period of time that we could not communicate, we could not travel across, and there was no direct flight. So all these things have gradually eased so that people across Taiwan Straits could once again resume normal relationship and communication. The recent movements by the DPP government is to cut it off. And it's almost like, they're a clan. So they're trying to throw away this pearl. They didn't want this to be a part of that claim. In the overall thesis of the Taiwan people, Taiwanness thesis, Taiwan has been occupied by Aborigine people from 10,000 years ago. And then starting from the great colonists, the Dutch, the Spain, the French, and the English, and the Americans, all were part of the Taiwan multicultural mosaic for a while. And then in 1895 to 1945, Japan was the last one coming. So instead of looking at Taiwan as having 400 years of migration from Fujian, Lai Ching-te in his inauguration speech, and that's very clear in his inauguration speech last year, he said 1624 was a very important year. It marked the Dutch office on Tainan marked 400 years of Taiwan going into the international trade. So you can see his overall sentiment of Taiwan is not a part of China, it's a part of international immigrants and migration, is deep rooted even in his inauguration speech. So starting from 10,000 years ago with the Aborigines to all the different colonists coming to Taiwan to today, the so-called Taiwanese is a people that's not Han. Han is, of course, the predominant Chinese. And therefore, let me give you one more data point. Recently, our government issued that Taiwan has about 2% of all the people from different parts, because we have Southeast Asian immigrants, have about 1% Aborigines, and the rest are called the rest. We're not called the Han or the Hakka or the Fujian. We are the rest. The 90% of the people in Taiwan are the rest of the people. So that's really deep rooted in that rebuilding a Taiwan identity and trying to cut off any connection with mainland China and try to make it a uniquely island culture. So there's a very funny statement in Taiwan. The swordfish is called qi yu, and the rest is called qi yu. So we have a lot of cartoons that putting a swordfish on my face. So we are also qi yu. We're now the swordfish people. The government is not joking. The government is claiming that the rest of the people, 95% of the people are simply the rest.
A lot of historical analogies come to mind of minorities that have tried to erase an identity, and it ended up in a lot of bloodshed. But I did not know it was this bad. I had suspected that there was, it's very obvious there's an anti-Han, anti-Fujian prejudice in Taiwan among the ruling party now. But I did not know that it had gone to the point that the people who are descended from the mainland are now simply called the rest. They don't even have a name. They're just lumped into a non-category as basically non-people.
Others. We are others.
I think it's true that Taiwan is a very culturally and ethnically and politically and historically complicated place. There have been a lot of people who have gone to that island and lived there, and that includes the people from Fujian and the rest of China. It seems if you want to tell, as you mentioned at the beginning, the whole truth about Taiwan, you would have to include the part where Fujian has...
Where it's not convenient.
And it's not convenient to a new ideology, a new identity, a new direction. I think you mentioned before that President Lai has gone so far as to say that they would be leaving China and entering the Bay, the northern...
Yes. Yeah, let me just add this
European
part. That's another data point for your audience. On April 2nd, Trump waged an international war against 185 countries. And the immediate response by Lai Ching-te is that this is an opportunity for us to 脱中入北. I have to use Chinese. 脱中 meaning leaving China. 入北 is getting into the north. It's global north. So with that 脱中入北, leaving China, entering global north, it is like Ukraine going into NATO, by the way. So going into the global north has a couple of components. For example, we're going to put TSMC and other high-tech chip manufacturing and related companies into the United States in exchange of a U.S. welcoming us into the global north, right? And then he actually mentioned about we are going to cooperate with mainland China, with the U.S. demand in terms of foreign reserve, in terms of exchanges, in terms of increasing our procurement of military articles. So all of these are his strategies to combat the April 2nd Trump Independence Day movement. Now, going into global north, I think it's something that even Japan has never achieved. Japan was the country that held a very strong aspiration to leave Asia and going into Europe. 脱亚入欧 was its original aspiration.
Right.
And after the Second World War, the US has brought Germany and Japan as its two arms into Europe and Asia to support its global strategy. So Japan was a very strong ally, but it still was not entirely in the North. It was part of the G7, but when it has its sort of chip aspiration, the chip aspiration was stemmed by the United States.
Right.
So if you have a dream of going into the global north, like Qingde, then you have to look at what happens to Japan and to look at what Japan and Germany has endured once they move outside of the US ambit, meaning that if they are working within what the United States is doing, they're okay. But once they are trying to step out of the bounds, then they oftentimes are not given the freedom to pursue their own dreams, let alone Taiwan, because Taiwan is an even more remote partner. We didn't have a joint defense treaty. We are not recognized as your diplomatic relationship. We don't have formal relationship with the United States. And we're not part of G7. We're not part of IMF. We're not part of all the things that the US built after the World War II. So Lai Ching-te has an aspiration, and he thought he could use that by agreeing to everything that the United States has asked us to do. On the other hand, once he truly 脱中 depart from China, he's gonna hurt our parts, our information technology, our basic consumer manufacturing sectors. So all of this, the middle part, the 30% of our global trade with the China partners will be hurt by his overall strategy. So 脱中入北 is his aspiration. There is no, not even a shred of reality that can support it. So I think when people look at what Taiwan is being put into, we no longer have the option of moving east or west. We are now betting all our chip on one basket, and we are also allowing this really strong regional hegemon, that's John Mearsheimer's words, this really strong regional hegemon to come to the West Pacific and use the first island chain as the most important strategic blockade against what they have deemed to be the number one pacing threat. So I don't see us having any ability to escape this possible disastrous scenario as you described. However, is that really the best for Taiwan? I think it's clearly not the best for Taiwan. It actually is disastrous because A, we don't have a very strong military capability of fighting China, unlike Ukraine has a strong military capability as a very, and also a very large territory vis-a-vis Russia. So we don't have the depth, nor do we have the strength if there were a military confrontation, nor do we have true support. Ukraine was at least given some nominal promises that they will be given. And they also were given arms articles, new strategic assets. We have not. The most recent delivery of M1A2T tanks are the most strategic assets that we've gotten in a very long time. Even our upgrade of F-16 have not been completed. So we don't have the most updated strategic assets. Unlike in the case of Ukraine, we don't have other countries pledging huge amount of military supports, and we didn't have that. We probably were counting on Japan, where you are, because Abe and the others have said if something happened to Taiwan, it would happen to Japan.
Right.
But the current prime minister, I don't think he repeated that statement again. The statement is no longer, quote unquote, solid as rock.
In some ways, the idea that Taiwan Yuji is a Nippon Yuji, that if something happens in Taiwan, it will affect Japan, that's obvious in a sense. If there were something in Taiwan, if there were some sort of war disaster, then a lot of Japanese people who live in Taiwan and other Taiwanese people would flee toward Okinawa. They would come to Japan. So in that sense, we would be affected, but they don't mean it in that way. What they mean to say is that they are expecting a war in Taiwan and they want to be a part of it. That's what they mean by that. And you're
Well,
right, the current prime minister is not saying that as much as the former one.
mhm. But that I would like you to repeat that as clearly as possible because that's interpreted by the current DPP government as well as the prior DPP government when Lai Ching-te was the vice president. They interpreted this as saying if something happens to Taiwan, Japan will come to Taiwan's aid, and that was simply the communication locally.
Right. I think it's, to use a word that you have just used, it's aspirational. People in Japan want to use, the conservatives want to use what they see as a coming war over Taiwan as a springboard to get Japan back militarily into the game, as it were, into the geopolitical game. So in that sense, it's not about Taiwan; it's about a chip, not a
Like a chess
microchip, but
piece.
a
Yeah.
right, a playing chip. That Taiwan is simply a convenient excuse to remilitarize. I think that's what the debate is really about. And you brought up Ukraine. At the very least, the United States recognizes Ukraine as a country. I
Mhm.
think that's an important point. And I repeat that to my friends here and when I talk about this in the United States. For all the promises that Washington makes, as you said at the beginning, they have every opportunity still to recognize Taiwan as a country, and they don't. I think that shows where their true interests, where their heart is.
Mhm. Well, the last part is you mentioned about the May 20th speech. I truly believe that some communication has taken place to Lai Ching-te because he did say something very provocative in the two interviews prior to May 20th. One is with a local KOL. He did say that China may invade Taiwan, 侵略. He used word as strong as that.
Hmm.
He also said it to a Japanese interviewer about Taiwan's dilemma and Taiwan's position. But he had opted not to say it on a very momentous day, which is May 20th.
Hmm.
So people can say, oh, this is just one of the interviews and not a declaration or a statement
I
on
see.
May 20th. So I do believe that there's some communication behind the scene to tell him to pull back a little bit, not to provoke China. And that is also why China did not react to his May 20th speech very strongly. And I have a personal knowledge that some of the special programs have been canceled because Lai Ching-te did not provoke China. However, what he has depicted as locally, for example, he's gonna increase the democratic and inclusive movement. He will not use hate as a means to mobilize people. All of these are simply not true because he is using hate and different kinds of identity politics to
Right.
mobilize people. And he is using our judicial system to interrogate, to incarcerate people without communication. Incarceration incommunicado, meaning that they are held in a very small room. They cannot talk to their families. They can only meet their lawyers in a very limited sense. And the oldest people that he has put into this position are about 75 to 80 years old. I suspect some of them will not come back whole. They will not come out whole because they are held for months and months. And this is not a democracy. It is not something that you'd be proud of and saying that we have human rights. And this is certainly not what DEI or the woke movement has claimed that Taiwan is such a friendly, such an opening country or place for them. This is not true.
The unfortunate reality in the United States is that I know of people who are in their 70s, 80s, who were put into prison. These are pro-life people. They were elderly women, and their only crime was trying to protect women and children, and they were put in prison as well. Washington and Taiwan, in that sense, they're both democratic in the sense that if democracy means putting your opponents into prison, well, then they're both very democratic. But beyond the irony, the black joke of democracy, the, the people of Taiwan, you mentioned the first island chain. This is a very important geopolitical concept. But I want to emphasize for the viewers that the first island chain, there are people who live on the first island chain. And
Exactly right.
Taiwan is a beautiful country. I've been there. I know people there. The people are wonderful, beautiful, open, happy people. They have a vibrant society. The food is very good. They have a really interesting history. The first island chain is not some abstraction. There are people who live their lives in the first island chain. And to me, that's what this is about. This is not a game. People are going to die if this path, if we keep going along this path of provocation and playing with
Mhm.
geopolitical fire.
And let me add one more thing. When people now tout TSMC or NVIDIA is going to hold a very large AI center in Taipei, just imagine we've had war across Taiwan Straits since 1949. We had the last fight in 1958. And TSMC and all these great technology, precision manufacturing developments all happened during the time that we're supposedly at war, but people across Taiwan Straits managed peace. So why would this fact be changed because the United States find a different utility value for Taiwan, for Taiwan to be a very useful sort of chess piece for them to ask mainland China in a moral ways or in their playbook. Just remember, we had TSMC while we were supposedly having war. So thank you for giving us an opportunity to talk about this. Pascal was a good friend, and he was the first one noticing that nobody reported April 26th. And after his interview, I searched different places. I found one other report of the April 26th. People went on the streets, not just the older people like me. You have a lot of young people who, for the first time, walk on the streets against DPP, because for many, many years, DPP had almost a monopoly of the young, idealistic students. But this time, young people also walk on the streets because they understand the deterioration of our so-called democratic system, and they also see the deterioration of Taiwan's peace and stability. And for them, their future is at risk. We are of a passing generation, but the new generation has a right to determine their future, and DPP has simply failed them.
Dr. Joanna Lei, one of the most important voices, perhaps the most important voice coming out of Taiwan today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to speak with you. Please come back and tell us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about Taiwan. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.